a stonemason's son, roaming the bustling Athenian marketplace and striking up a conversation with anybody willing to have one. His face likened to a satyr, broad nose, bulging eyes, walking barefoot in shabby clothes. Yet people stop and listen. This figure is Socrates. Despite, or perhaps because of, his self-depreciating claim, I know only that I know nothing. He sparked a revolution in thought. It was 399 BC that Socrates stood trial for his life, accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the city's gods. Instead of pleading for mercy, he used the opportunity to teach, challenging Athens one last time with his unwavering commitment to truth and virtue. But why exactly did this eccentric old man prefer death to abandoning his principles? To answer that is to go deep into the real teachings of Socrates. Lessons delivered not in formal lectures or books, but in relentless questions and an exemplary life. And that's what we're going to do today. Welcome to the channel, everyone. Talking about Socrates today. What exactly did he teach? We're going to explain it in the most simplistic manner that we can, so that we can all understand exactly what was going on. Now, first of all, thank you very much to those who have already clicked that like and subscribe button. For those who have not already done so, I assume that you will take the next few seconds to do so. Thank you in advance. And thank you once again to those who checked out the merch store and those supporting on the Patreon. Always good to see that, keeping the channel going. Now, without further ado and all the customary introductions out of the way, all out of good manners, of course, we can begin. Of course, the best place to start is by giving a little background on who Socrates actually was, for those who are new and for not quite familiar with him. So the story starts 470 BC in Athens, a time of cultural flowering and political turmoil. Socrates had lived through the golden age of Athens, but also the destructive Peloponnesian War. Unlike the typical image of a cloistered scholar, Socrates served as a hoplite, that is a foot soldier in the Athenian army, distinguishing himself with bravery in battles at Pontidea and Delium. Yet it was not military prowess or public office that made him famous. It was his distinct approach to philosophy. There's many paths to glory in ancient Greece. Philosophy was certainly one of them. Athens in the 5th century BC was teeming with new ideas, where Sophists, the wandering professional teachers, promised to impart wisdom and success for a fee. However, Socrates seemed to have positioned himself quite differently. He claimed to possess no wisdom to sell, had a modest upbringing, and by some accounts trained in his father's craft of stonemasonry, and he never wrote a single word of philosophy. Instead, he made the streets of Athens his classroom, engaging ordinary citizens, politicians, craftsmen, and young aristocrats in dialogues about the deepest questions of human life. Socrates' era valued public debate and rhetoric, but he became notorious for turning conventional discussion on its head. He didn't lecture or proclaim grand theories about the cosmos. In fact, he often professed ignorance about many subjects, with a shrug of the shoulders. I don't know. Ask someone else, maybe. It takes a lot of guts to admit that. But what he did do was ask questions. He was great at starting conversations, getting people to think. Simple yet disarmingly profound questions like, what is virtue? What is justice? Those who stopped to talk with him often found themselves entangled in a rigorous examination of their own beliefs. It was through these conversations that Socrates developed a following of young students fascinated by his charisma and intellect. Among them was Plato and, of course, Xenophon, who would later record his words and deeds. However, he also attracted suspicion and hostility from some of his fellow Athenians, who viewed his constant questioning as subversive. So to understand Socrates' teaching, we have to know our sources. Socrates wrote nothing himself, as we mentioned, so what we know comes from three main contemporaries. The first is Plato, of course. That is Socrates' most famous student, who wrote philosophical dialogues with Socrates as the central character. Plato's early works, like Apology or Euthyphro, are considered fairly reliable portrayals of Socratic thought, while later works tend to use Socrates as more of a mouthpiece for Plato's own ideas. Xenophon was another student of Socrates, a soldier and historian. His writings about Socrates, such as the Memorabilia and Apology, depict a more practical, plain-spoken teacher. His Socrates gives common-sense moral advice and engages in down-to-earth conversations, somewhat complementary to the image we get from Plato. And then, lastly, we have the playwright and contemporary of Socrates, Aristophanes, who lampooned him in a comedy called The Clouds. Aristophanes portrays Socrates as a caricature, a sophist and natural philosopher with his head literally in the clouds, which shows how some Athenians perceived Socrates' activities with either skepticism or some outright ridicule. But each source provides a different angle. Plato gives us the philosophical depth for Socratic thinking. Xenophon offers glimpses of Socrates' everyday interactions and personality, and Aristophanes reflects the public satire and, I suppose, the misunderstandings that Socrates had faced. So by triangulating these accounts, that is how we sketch the historical Socrates and his core teachings with a little bit more confidence. But we always have to be aware that we are seeing him through others' eyes and perhaps others' judgment. But if there is one singular thing that Socrates is famous for, it is his method of teaching. Rather than delivering sermons or writing treatises, Socrates taught by asking questions and engaging in dialogue. This approach, now known as the Socratic Method, was his hallmark. He would begin by feigning ignorance, what is often called Socratic irony. For example, he might approach a self-assured politician or a reputed expert and say, "I know nothing about courage. Perhaps you can explain what courage really is." As the person attempted to define or explain the concept, Socrates would probe deeper with more questions. What do you mean by that? Is that true in all cases? Are there any exceptions? When the interlocutor offered an answer, Socrates examined it for logical consistency and clarity. Through this relentless questioning, Socrates exposed contradictions or gasps in his partner's knowledge. The immediate result was often called aporia, a state of puzzlement or impasse, where the person realizes they do not actually know what they thought they knew. Far from being mere intellectual showmanship, this was precisely Socrates' goal. He believes that recognizing one's own ignorance is the first step toward genuine understanding. He compared himself to a gadfly stinging the sluggish horse of Athens, irritating people in order to awaken them to reality. By unsettling complacent confidence, Socrates opened the way for true learning. I suppose for some people, it is very confronting when they're exposed for not being the reputed experts that they had thought themselves to be, and perhaps convinced many others that they were. You can see why Socrates was not universally popular, sure. So in practice, a typical Socratic dialogue, as described in Plato's early works, goes through stages. First, Socrates poses a big question. For example, what is justice? It's hard for us to explain it, isn't it, right? We all want justice. But define it. That's where Socrates comes in. Of course, somebody ventures an answer, and then Socrates asks clarifying questions, and perhaps proposes hypothetical situations to test the answer. Now, if there is inconsistencies emerging, the answer is refined, or a new one is proposed. The cycle repeats, often ending with the participants admitting that they have not yet found a satisfactory definition. This process is called elenchus, or cross-examination. While it can feel negative, since Socrates often disproved false beliefs without giving a final truth, Socrates saw it as profoundly constructive. It cleared away false knowledge, the illusion of understanding, and spawned a deeper quest for truth. An example of the Socratic method in action is found in Plato's dialogue Euthyphro. Socrates meets Euthyphro, a man confident that he knows all about piety, that is, holiness. Socrates, professing his own ignorance about what piety really means, asks Euthyphro to define it. Each definition Euthyphro gives, piety is what the gods love, for instance, prompts Socrates to examine the inconsistencies, raising the famous dilemma. Do the gods love the pious because it is pious, or is it pious because they love it? It's a good point. Either way, by the end, Euthyphro abandons the conversation in pure frustration, confidence surely shaken. But Socrates' goal wasn't to lord over people and humiliate them, but just to demonstrate that true wisdom begins by acknowledging how much you do not know. This question-driven pedagogy was radically different from the didactic teaching of the Sophists. Socrates charged no fees and often drew no firm conclusions, whereas Sophists were paid to deliver polished lectures or rhetoric. In fact, Socrates insisted that he was not a teacher at all in the conventional sense. He likened himself to a midwife even, helping others give birth to their own understanding. This maieutic or midwifery aspect of his method meant that knowledge had to come from within the student, through critical thinking and self-reflection. By refusing to spoon-feed answers, Socrates empowered his listeners to think for themselves. It's an approach that's still used in education and law schools today, at least the good ones, where instructors ask probing questions to develop students' reasoning rather than just telling them the facts. Now, you've got to remember that Socrates' questioning style was not some gimmick. It stemmed from a deep philosophical stance about knowledge itself. One of the most famous anecdotes about Socrates is the story of the Delphic oracle. According to Plato's Apology, Socrates' friend Chaerephon once asked the oracle of Delphi, that is a priestess famed for prophetic utterances. I have a video on Greek oracles if you're interested. Whether anybody was wiser than Socrates, that was the question. The oracle replied that no one was wiser. Now, when Socrates heard this, he was pretty confused, since he never considered himself to be wise at all. Determined to understand the god's message, he set out to find someone wiser than himself, questioning prominent men who had a reputation for wisdom, politics, and also poets and craftsmen. But what he found was that while many people thought themselves to be wise, their understanding fell apart under careful examination. They believed they knew a great deal, but in truth, they did not. It was all surface level. Socrates realized that, paradoxically, he was the wisest, but only in the sense that he alone recognized his own ignorance. He concluded, I am wiser than this man. Neither of us probably knows anything worthwhile, but he thinks he knows something when he does not, whereas I, as I do not know anything, do not think that I do. Now, this insight is often summarized as the famous, "I know that I know nothing." It's become a cornerstone of Socratic thought, a statement of profound intellectual humility. Socrates was not literally claiming to know nothing at all, of course, but rather that he lacked the true wisdom about the ultimate truths. This awareness made him perpetually inquisitive and open-minded. It's the reason why he kept asking questions. Every conversation was an opportunity for both him and his interlocutor to inch closer to genuine knowledge, and that's definitely a conversation worth having. But importantly, Socrates also believed that acknowledging ignorance could protect one from false confidence and moral error. He saw pretensions to knowledge as dangerous. If a leader claims to know what justice is, but really does not, he might create unjust laws, thinking them to be righteous. Socrates' antidote was to always test and examine such claims. His skepticism about his own knowledge was not cynicism, not at all. It was more of a positive strategy for broad learning. By admitting, "I don't have any answers, let's find out together," he modeled an approach to truth that values constant inquiry over easy certainty. This attitude is the heart of what we now call the Socratic spirit, a combination of humility and relentless curiosity. And I hope that we can all be imbued with that spirit. But Socrates' intellectual humility was coupled with a kind of confidence in reason. He trusted that through disciplined questioning, humans could get closer to the truth. He devoted his life to this search. Even at his trial, when confronting the jury, Socrates did not abandon this stance. He famously told the court that if they offered to acquit him on the condition he stopped practicing philosophy, that he would refuse. Of course, we get another famous quote from this part of his life, which is, "The unexamined life is not worth living for a human being," was what he declared in his defense. To cease questioning and examining, to pretend one had all the answers, or to simply accept the dogmatic thought of the time, would be for Socrates worse than death anyway, or at least to live less than fully. It's a striking statement, delivered in the face of a possible death sentence. It shows how earnest Socrates was about the importance of continual inquiry and self-examination. While Socrates claimed not to have knowledge of astronomy or cosmology, or other subjects that the earlier philosophers pursued, he did have strong convictions about ethical matters. In fact, ancient writers like Aristotle credit Socrates with bringing philosophy down from the heavens, as in, well, making it focused more on ethics and human life, rather than things out of human spheres of control. Socrates was less interested in what the stars were made of, and far more interested in questions like, what is the right way to live? What is justice, courage, piety? Can virtue be taught? Things like this. These questions of moral philosophy were at the center of Socrates' conversations, and from the records we have, a distinctive ethical viewpoint emerges. At the heart of Socratic ethics is the idea that virtue and knowledge are intimately linked, even in a sense, the same thing. Socrates repeatedly suggested that if a person truly knows what is good, he or she will do what is good. Conversely, all wrongdoing arises from ignorance. This claim is sometimes called the Socratic paradox, because it challenges our usual assumptions about weakness of will. Most people might say, "I know what the right thing to do is, but I just don't do it." Socrates would respond that if you fail to do the right things, then you didn't really know, at least not in the full, proper sense of knowing what the right thing was. Perhaps you were aware of the right thing, but you did not fully understand the right thing. For Socrates, genuine knowledge isn't just about intellectual awareness. It penetrates one's character and motivates someone into right action. For example, in Plato's dialogue Protagoras, Socrates argues against the idea that someone can know the good but choose the bad. He insists that no one errs or does wrong willingly, another one of his famous maxims. Every person, he argues, naturally desires what they believe is good for them. If they do evil or make harmful choices, it must be because they are mistaken. They actually believe at some level what they're doing will bring some good or happiness, even if they're wrong about it. In short, all evil is the result of ignorance. This is a radically intellectualist view of morality. Becoming a better person is fundamentally about becoming wiser. To know justice is to act justly. To know courage is to act courageously. And from this perspective, the cultivation of virtue is the cultivation of knowledge. Not technical or scientific knowledge, but a deep understanding of the knowledge of what is truly good. Are you staying with me? Well, Socrates often emphasized caring for one's soul, that is the seat of wisdom and character, above all worldly concerns. According to Plato's Apology, Socrates told the jurymen that his divine mission was to persuade them to care not for wealth or reputation, but for virtue and wisdom first and foremost, saying, quote from the Apology, "Wealth does not bring goodness, but goodness brings wealth and every other blessing, both to the individual and to the state." This conviction that moral virtue is the highest good colored every single aspect of Socrates' life and teaching. So let's just summarize some key principles, just so we're very, very clear on everything. Ones that Socrates taught about ethics and virtues. First, it is that virtue is the highest good. Moral excellence is more valuable than fame, power, or money, and a virtuous soul is your most precious possession. The next is that virtue is knowledge. True goodness requires true understanding. If you genuinely know what is right, you will do what is right. No one errs willingly. Everyone naturally desires what they think is good. If a person acts wrongly, it is only because they are mistaken or ignorant about what good truly is. Also, it's better to suffer than to do wrong, or suffer wrong than to do wrong, pardon me. That is, committing an injustice harms your soul, which is worse than any harm you might suffer as a victim. Therefore, one must never do wrong, even in return. And lastly, the unexamined life is not worth living. Living ethically requires constant self-reflection. Socrates believes that only by continually examining your beliefs and actions, we can keep our souls aligned with virtue and truth. The ideas themselves might sound a little abstract, but Socrates made them concrete through dialogues. For instance, in Plato's Crito, we see Socrates in prison after being sentenced to death. His wealthy friend Crito offers to finance an escape and urges Socrates to flee and save his life. But Socrates refuses. He doesn't base his refusal on simple loyalty to the city or a death wish. Instead, he engages Crito in a discussion about justice and injustice. Socrates leads Crito to agree that doing wrong is never justified, even if one has been wronged. So escaping from prison would violate the laws and harm the city that raised him, which Socrates sees as an unjust act. So he concludes that it is better to accept the unjust verdict than to commit an injustice himself by breaking the laws. So this exemplifies his commitment to the principle that one must never do evil, even in response to evil, a commitment born from his belief that maintaining virtue, justice, is more important than any other consequence. Socrates' stance that virtue is knowledge was later criticized by philosophers like his pupil Plato, who in later works recognized that people can act against their better knowledge, and also by Aristotle, who developed the concept of akrasia, that is, weakness of will. Yet Socrates' bold assertion was meant to jolt his contemporaries into rethinking morality. If all people really seek the good, then moral education is the crucial task, and ignorance, that's the true enemy. Socrates devoted himself to fighting that ignorance. He didn't merely want to win arguments. He wanted his interlocutors to become better. Xenophon's accounts often highlight this aspect. Socrates is a moral guide who tries to cure the perplexities of his friends and lead them toward more virtuous lives. In Xenophon's Memorabilia, we see Socrates tutoring companions on self-discipline, responsibility, and justice in very practical terms, always steering them to see that understanding the good leads to doing the good. Socrates seems to have seen himself as having a kind of divine mission. He famously likened himself to a gadfly stinging a great but sluggish horse, that being the Athenian state, preventing it from becoming complacent. In his trial speech, Apology, Socrates explains that by pestering people with questions and goading them to think, he is actually doing the city a service, keeping it awake morally and intellectually. This was not a role he sought for fame or pleasure. He believed he was guided by a divine calling. Socrates mentions a peculiar inner voice or sign, his daimonion, which he experienced as a sort of spiritual intuition that would warn him when he was about to take a wrong step. Interestingly, this inner voice never told him what to do. It only stopped him from doing certain things. He notes that it often fell silent when he was on the right path. He took the existence of this guiding voice as evidence that he was meant to live the life of a philosopher in the way he did. The idea of the examined life flows directly from Socrates' mission, because he believed that care of the soul through pursuit of wisdom and virtue was the highest duty. He practiced and preached constant self-examination and discussion. When he says the examined life is not worth living, he's emphasizing that a life without reflection, where one simply follows the crowd or adheres to uncritically accepted beliefs, is a waste of time and potential. For Socrates, every person has the capacity and even the responsibility to reflect on questions like, what is my life aiming at, and are my beliefs justified? Only through such reflection can one improve their soul. In Plato's Apology, Socrates recounts how he went around questioning people as service to the gods, following the oracle's pronouncement. He admits this behavior earned him quite a lot of hostility, as nobody likes to have their ignorance revealed, of course. Yet he persisted, believing that provoking thought was the greatest good he could do for others. He says to the jury, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy, exhorting anyone whom I meet, saying, are you not ashamed of caring so much for money and fame and ambition, when you neither think nor care about wisdom and truth and the perfection of your soul? This captures Socrates' mission in his own words, to remind his fellow citizens to prioritize their state of their soul, their moral and intellectual integrity over material concerns. It's worth noting, though, that Socrates was not universally appreciated as a noble gadfly, that's for sure. Many Athenians felt stung in less positive ways. To those he publicly embarrassed, I suppose exposing their ignorance on a grander scale, he was a nuisance, or even a dangerous influence on the youth, since many young Athenians enjoyed watching venerable figures being reduced to confusion by Socrates' questions. Over the years, these tensions built up. Athenians, proud of their wisdom or status, didn't take kindly to this strange man exposing their ignorance. And indeed, some of Socrates' own followers became controversial. Alcibiades, yes, that one, a brilliant but treacherous politician and general, had been close to Socrates in his youth, and Critias, one of the violent 30 tyrants who briefly overthrew Athenian democracy, had also associated with Socrates. By 399, 3 citizens, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, brought formal charges against Socrates for, quote, not recognizing the gods the city recognizes, introducing new divinities, and corrupting the youth, which was effectively a trial of Socrates' way of life and teaching. Socrates met his trial with the same steadfast commitment to his principles that he had shown all his life. He defended himself by explaining his mission and questioning his accusers in turn. Famously, rather than ingratiate himself with the jury, he maintained an unapologetic tone. When found guilty, he was given a chance to propose a lesser penalty than death. In a bit of a characteristic irony, he suggested that far from punishing him, the city should reward him with free meals for life at the town hall, the sort of honor given to an Olympic champion, because in his view, he really had helped Athens by challenging its citizens to think. Of course, this did not amuse the jury. They didn't see the joke, I suppose. Juries are not known for their good humor, and it likely contributed to the vote for the death penalty. However, Socrates was not being flippant. He genuinely believed in the positive value of his philosophic mission. One of the official accusations against Socrates was impiety, that is, failing to acknowledge the city's gods or introducing new ones. And this charge is pretty interesting because Socrates often spoke about the gods and was notably guided by a spiritual inner voice. So how did Socrates conceive of piety and the divine? The evidence is somewhat mixed and comes primarily from Plato's Euthyphro and Apology, along with Xenophon's writings. We'll start with Euthyphro. Now, as mentioned earlier, Socrates questions Euthyphro on the nature of piety or holiness. Though the dialogue ends, without a clear definition, as per usual, Socrates' probing questions suggest that he was not satisfied with a simple "what the gods like" answer. It must be deeper than that, and he was searching for a more rational principle of piety beyond the capricious wills of the traditional Greek pantheon. Socrates certainly did not outright deny the existence of the gods. In fact, in the Apology, he cites his own philosophical mission as something ordained by them, as per the Delphic oracle's message, and references his daimonion as kind of a divine sign. It implies he had a very personal sense of divine guidance, and you can't really have that while being an atheist, now can't you? What Socrates likely rejected was a conventional storytelling about the gods which perceived them as immoral or petty. He was accused of introducing new divinities, possibly because of his talk of the inner voice, or because he spoke of the god's will, perhaps interpreting the oracle's pronouncement in a monotheistic way. His defense in Apology to the impiety charge was that he does believe in gods after all. He acknowledges spiritual agencies like the daimonion, and one cannot believe in spiritual matters without having a solid belief in the spirit world. Thus he argued that the charge itself was contradictory. Socrates' reverence for the divine was intertwined with his political and philosophical quest. He seemed to believe that the gods wanted him to pursue and encourage virtue. In Xenophon's Memorabilia, there is an account of Socrates reasoning with a skeptic about the existence of gods. Socrates points to the evident order and beneficial design in the world. Our eyes are adapted to see, ears to hear. Cycles of nature support life, arguing that such grand design implies a wise and benevolent designer. This argument from design is quite a sophisticated theological reasoning for the time, suggesting Socrates had a more philosophical conception of deity than the average Athenian. Rather than focusing on rituals and sacrifices, Socrates emphasized living rightly as the true way to honor the divine. He was known to participate in the customary religious practices of Athens, For example, he served on the council, and when he happened to preside over a trial, he refused to break his oath even under pressure, which could be seen as a pious respect for law and justice. And touching on a pretty poignant detail, in Plato's work Phaedo, which describes Socrates' final moments, it notes that Socrates' last words were to ask a friend to sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing, a gesture that could be interpreted as Socrates symbolically thanking the god for a cure, perhaps meaning death as a cure for all the ills of life. So even at the end, Socrates kept one foot in traditional piety, while philosophically reinterpreting what true piety meant. But I suppose that was the problem. It wasn't pious in a sense that people were satisfied with. And so I suppose, in summary, Socrates had taught a form of piety that was deeply ethical. The gods are wise and good, so the best way to honor them is to seek wisdom and goodness. He challenged shallow or literalist views of religion, steering conversations to questions of moral truth, things people could engage with on a human level. But that approach, however, was not easily understood by all, and it contributed to the suspicion that he was indeed impious. His conviction was likely less about an actual irreligion and more about politics and personal vendettas. But it does show that his philosophical mission put him at odds with many traditionalists. But then we have the situation of Socrates' interactions with the Sophists, a different kind of teacher. Sophists of Athens were the educators for hire of Socrates' day. If you wanted a teacher, that's who you'd go to. They taught politics, rhetoric, and virtue as they claimed to anyone who could pay, often promising success in public life as the outcome of their teachings. Sophists like Protagoras, Hippias, and Gorgias were a celebrity of a sort, flashy, well compensated, and sometimes viewed with suspicion for their relativistic or materialistic ideas. Socrates was frequently lumped together with the Sophists in the public mind. After all, he too dealt with philosophical questions, and had young followers hanging on his every word. But Socrates was not happy with this association. He took pains to distinguish himself from them, and understanding this difference is key to grasping what Socrates really taught. So first and foremost, Socrates did not take money for conversation. This was not just a quirk, it was a reflection of his belief that wisdom was not a commodity to be sold, and that teaching virtue for a fee undermines the sincerity of the enterprise. He lived a life of relative poverty, which gave moral credibility to his message. He clearly was not in it for material gain. Now, secondly, the Sophists were often relativists about truth and morality. For example, Protagoras famously said, "Man is the measure of all things," implying that truth is subjective and varies from person to person. In contrast, Socrates, at least as portrayed by Plato and Xenophon, was convinced that there are objective truths to be found in virtues and justice. His constant asking of what is X, what is Y, presupposed that X has a real nature or definition, while a sophist might teach you how to make the weaker argument appear stronger, a skill useful in law courts irrespective of the truth, by the way. Socrates was interested in making the weaker soul stronger by leading it to the truth. He was deeply concerned with genuine definitions, not merely persuasive definitions. Another difference was purpose. Sophists aimed to equip students with skills, especially rhetorical ones, to achieve success, power, or worldly ends. Socrates aimed to improve souls. This is why sometimes he irked those in power. He would question their moral knowledge rather than teach them tricks to get their way. Socrates didn't claim to have all the answers, but Sophists often did, selling their supposed wisdom. Socrates insisted on questioning assumptions. Sophists, by contrast, were sometimes seen as reinforcing whatever assumptions would win an argument for their client. The confusion between Socrates and the Sophists was not helped by Aristophanes' satire in the clouds. In that play, Socrates is depicted as running a thinkery, where hapless students learn ridiculous logical fallacies and natural sciences, like measuring how high a flea can jump or how to argue one's way out of debt. Which, hey, I think that's a pretty good skill. While the comedic Socrates teaches a young man to disrespect his parents and twist arguments. This was a distorted parody, sure, very obvious, but Athenians who saw the play might have believed that Socrates was just another sophist, or something worse than that. Socrates addressed this in his apology, noting that he's been maligned by caricature for years, and that his accusers are capitalizing on that mistaken image. But in reality, Socrates' teaching style and aims were fundamentally at odds with the sophistic approach. He even disclaimed being any kind of teacher at all. In the sense of imparting knowledge, he was more like a catalyst. A modern analogy might be a mentor who insists you learn by doing and thinking, rather than handing you a manual and wishing you the best of luck. Socrates would accompany somebody in the search of truth, not claim to have packaged truth ready to deliver. Now, that being said, Socrates did engage in sophists in conversation. Plato's dialogues, Protagoras and Gorgias, show Socrates debating these figures. In those texts, we see Socrates challenging the sophists on whether virtue can be taught, and what virtue even means, and on whether rhetoric without concern for truth is morally acceptable. These dramatized debates show Socrates' difference. He continually presses for clarity and moral responsibility, whereas his opponents often end up revealing that they prioritize winning or expediency over the truth. So to sum it up, Socrates taught against the prevailing cynicism and relativism of the Sophists. He believed in an absolute sense of justice and virtue, and it was worth pursuing, but quite difficult to pin down. He taught by example that a life spent seeking the truth and goodness was superior to a life spent chasing power or indulging in clever persuasion. In a way, he was a moral counterweight to the Sophists, emphasizing integrity and wisdom over success at any cost. So, why not, for a bit of fun before we go, talk about a few anecdotes about his life that are equally illuminating and I think bring his teachings to life too. Of course, he's known for his philosophical ideas, but there's more to it than that. He did not separate philosophy from how he lived. He was the message he delivered in many respects. So consider these few glimpses of Socrates, which reveal a man of paradoxical and endearing quality. First, unlike the stereotypical intellectual, Socrates was physically hardy. He went everywhere barefoot, and apparently thought little of material comfort. In Plato's Symposium, the handsome general Alcibiades describes Socrates on a military campaign. During the bitter winter at Potidaea, Socrates walked barefoot on the ice, while others bundled up, yet he seemed completely untroubled by the cold. He also had astonishing powers of concentration. One story tells that Socrates once stood stock still in meditation from dawn throughout the entire day and night, thinking about a problem, much to the astonishment of his fellow soldiers. And in battle, he showed true courage. Alcibiades recounts how Socrates saved his life during a retreat, and even when the enemy was at rout at the Battle of Delium, Socrates withdrew calmly and in control, possibly preventing panic among the Athenians. A delightful, lesser-known side of Socrates appears in Xenophon's Symposium, not Plato's Symposium, Xenophon's. At a dinner party, after watching a skilled young dancer perform, Socrates good-natured attempts a few dancers' steps himself. In fact, a friend teased that he'd seen Socrates dancing alone in the early morning. Socrates didn't deny it. He cheerfully explained that he often practiced a bit of dancing at dawn as a form of exercise to keep fit and freshen the appetite. The image of the aged, pot-bellied philosopher dancing by himself in his house, simply for the joy and the health of it, is quite enduring. It kind of breaks the mold of Socrates being this stern moralist. And it reminds us that for Socrates, care of the soul didn't exclude taking care of the body in that simple, balanced way, and that joy and playfulness were all part of a well-lived life too. Now what about his family and personal relationships? Well, Socrates was married. In fact, some sources say he had two wives, Xanthippe being the most famous, and possibly a second named Myrto, though that is less historically certain. Xanthippe has come down through legend as the archetype of a shrewish wife, and many colourful anecdotes depict her temper clashing with Socrates' equanimity. The most famous story is that one day Xanthippe scolded Socrates harshly in public, and in a fit of frustration dumped an entire pot of water over his head. Instead of reacting angrily, Socrates took it in his stride with a witty remark, "After the thunder comes the rain." I'm sure his wife saw the humor in that, or whether it's true or not, it highlights Socrates' calm humor in domestic life. He himself explained, as per Xenophon, that he chose to marry Xanthippe because dealing with her spirited temperament was good training, much like a horseman choosing a feisty and unruly horse to improve his skill, and he joked that by learning to live with Xanthippe, he could get along with anyone. Well, I'm sure that poor old Xanthippe appreciates the romantic sentiment. Well, she mustn't have been too opposed to it, because they had 3 sons. But by Socrates' own admission, he didn't do much in raising them. His mind was always set on other things. Still, he showed affection. In Plato's Phaedo, we see Socrates briefly comfort his weeping friends, and even his distraught wife, whom he gently asks to be led away so he can meet his death calmly. It paints a picture of a man who, while philosophically single-minded, still cared about others on a human level. Taken together, it reinforces the coherence with these antidotes between Socrates' teachings and his life. He valued self-control and demonstrated it through personal endurance and temperament. He valued humor and perspective, never taking himself too seriously, and he tried to act according to the virtues he discussed. His life was his final teaching. When Socrates, at age 70, drank the cup of hemlock poison at his execution, he did so with remarkable composure, discussing philosophy, the immortality of the soul with his disciples until the very end. He even censured his friends for crying, gently asking them to let him die in peace. In doing so, he showed that for him, death was certainly not the worst evil, but wrongdoing was. And so he faced his death with the peace of someone whose conscience was clear, and whose soul was, in his view, ready for whatever would come next. And so we see that Socrates taught not only through doctrines, but through example and dialogue, and that's a legacy that's profoundly shaped the entire concept of Western thought. His actual teachings can be distilled into a few powerful ideas that I want you to remember. Examine your life, know that you do not know, seek virtue through understanding, and never compromise your moral integrity. He challenged those around him to question everything, define their terms, and live by principle. In an academic sense, he revolutionized philosophy by focusing on ethics and how one ought to live, but his style was still accessible. He spoke in the marketplace free of charge, used analogies from everyday life, and possessed a sharp wit. This is why we can imagine him giving a university lecture today. I suppose it'd be pretty unpredictable, but intellectually rigorous, possibly filled with that plain-spoken humor. And so the historical Socrates emerges as a man of irony and paradox, wise because he knew his own ignorance, influential while claiming no authority, deeply rational yet guided by a divine inner voice, and condemned as a criminal, yet history remembers him as a martyr for truth. I wonder if those on the jury saw that coming. His teachings force us to confront our own beliefs and ask, as he did, what is a good life for a human being? In hearing Socrates' story and ideas, we're effectively being invited into one of his conversations, and it's a conversation that has continued for over 2,000 years. Each of us, examining in our life, becomes a student of Socrates. Perhaps that's his most enduring teaching at all, that philosophy is not reserved for academics and specialists, but it's a way of living that's open to anyone. As long as you're willing to think critically, that's all you need. Well, that's it from me. Thank you so much for joining me again today. It's been a pleasure talking about Socrates. You know, in the spirit of Socrates, I suppose it's that the main question of this entire talk, what did Socrates actually teach? Well, that is, I suppose, a Socratic question in itself. What is the Socratic method? What is Socratic philosophy? Well, I hope you know now. But I also hope you know that you don't know. And I know that you don't know. And you know that I know that you don't know. Okay? Thank you. I will thank my top tiers and patrons and supporters. That's Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Amber, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carey, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfidnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Orthodox Review on YouTube. Go check out his channel. Scott, Stark Factory, Charles, Wendy, Josie, Ryan, Sarah, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, Crystal, the HMSHH, Talbury, and Anthony. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I will see you in the next video, okay? Hope you enjoyed it. Good night. Lots of love to you all.